So a couple of thoughts came to me as I'm getting ready to do episode 3 of Cuto. I wrote these books so long ago that I have to go back and review them to get the sequence of action right. And uh, so what what I want to tell you, one I've mentioned before, is there's a whole separate side of the book going on with the modern kids, Juan and Sophia, identical twins, 13 years old. It's about 1995, who come into possession of the medallion, and that their adventures parallel the uh, adventures of now Cuto and Adzul, and then after that Lita and Tukor and Ricardo. So there's a whole half of the book that I'm not even addressing. The second thing I've noticed as I've kind of reviewed my writing is that I there's a lot more detail in the written book than I can give you in a 30-minute segment. Um, I get the thrust of the narrative, okay, but I just noticed today reviewing for episode 3 that there's a lot of detail that's pretty cool that you know slips away and trying to do a 30-minute episode. So I just wanted to, you know, mention that. Those of you who read the books know that. Those of you who haven't read the books, you just have to find out. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them in the libraries if you're in Wyoming, near Sheridan, or in Wyoming, because Wyoming has a library system throughout the state. But if you're elsewhere, you probably gotta buy them, and they're not real expensive. But just to give you some idea about that. So let's go on with Cuto. So if you remember, they're camped, and the medallion gets hot, waking Cuto just just as there was the faintest band of light across the eastern horizon. And he lies there quietly and hears an owl hoot out in the desert. And then he hears another owl hoot behind him out in the desert. And then the yip of a coyote. Now, he's very, very familiar with wild animals, and he knows that those calls are coming too close together to be from owls or coyotes. So, in a whisper, he leans across Swallow and speaks to Rhea and says, "There's men around the camp. Get up, get your sling out, and be ready." And in an instant, she's wide awake. Um, he very, very quietly gets up and uh, wakes up the other 5 men. They're all sleeping around the campfire. And in minutes, the men are up with atlatls loaded with spears. They're all facing outward, away from the fire, in a sort of a circle, 7 of them. Swallow's still sleeping. Um, the medallion doesn't get burning hot, but it's hot. And the one thing they all notice is there's no birds chirping, no birds waking up and chirping in the bushes and trees of the little grove that they're camped in. Everything is dead quiet, and it's getting lighter and lighter. And all of a sudden, without warning, 15 men appear surrounding the camp in a circle. Every one of them has a bow with at full draw with an arrow aimed at one of the seven. Cuto and Rhea had started their slings slowly whirling before the men appeared, and the other five, had their atlatls up, ready to throw. And in silence, the two groups stare at each other, and nothing happens. Cuto waits, and he finally says in a low voice, "Lower your weapons. If they had wanted to attack, I think they're uncertain. If they'd wanted to attack, we'd all be dead by now." And so the men lowered their atlatls, and Cuto and Rhea stopped their slings, and they stood facing these guys. As he looked, Cuto saw that one of these men was taller than the others. He had a single feather in his hair. About half of them were just in loincloths. Others had cotton shirts and pants, very, very much like the Aztecs wore. All of them had knee-high leather boots. And they stared at one another. Now, when Cuto spoke to the men, telling them to lower their weapons, Swallow woke up. And she caught sight of painted faces on these 15 warriors around them, and she flew up off the ground and flew to Rhea, and Rhea put her arm around her and hugged her close to her, and they all stared. Swallow searched, was terrified. She thought the Comanche had found him. And all of a sudden, without warning, she pulls away from Rhea and charges as fast as she can on her injured feet across the camp toward the warrior with the feather in his hair. And he redirects his arrow, points it right at her. The bows are still at full draw. All the bows are still at full draw. And he just shifts the aim of his arrows, pointing right at her, and she keeps coming. And he looks, and then he releases the tension on his bow and goes to his knees, and she runs right into him. And he drops the bow and grabs her with both arms, and hugs her to him, and then he pulls her back and studies her face for a minute. She's got this bandage still all over her head, and then hugs her close and says one word in a strange language to the men. And the men all drop their arrows, point their arrows at the ground. And he says one more word, and the men all release the tension completely on their bows, put their arrows into quivers across their back, and gather around Swallow and this man. And Swallow all of a sudden leaves the man and runs over and grabs Cuto and Rhea by the hand and brings them toward this man. And in sign language, she basically says, "This is my father, and these are his men. This is my father." And then she says something to the Indian, speaks rapidly to the Indian, and turns, and he goes into sign language and says, "My daughter, Swallow, has explained how you rescued her and have bandaged her and helped her to heal. We're in your debt." And Cuto says, in sign language, says, "Well, we have some food in our packs. Um, let's let's eat." And they go back to the fire, and the Aztecs build up the fire, go to the packs and get corn and tortillas and stuff from the packs. And they still have the pig from the night before. They cut slices of the pig, and pretty soon they're roasting pig. And Cuto gets two blankets and puts them on the ground, and they sit. He and Rhea sit facing the leader, who has identified himself again in sign language as Feather. And so Kuto's asking, what what are you doing out here? Swallow told us, she was captured 2 years ago, and you guys, you're painted for war. And the leader says, yes, two of our women were captured and murdered some days ago by conquistadors, and we are tracking them down. We found the bodies out in the desert and followed these men, and they're staying to ravines and staying out of sight and heading south. And he said that's the pattern of deserters from the conquistador forces. And we've been following them for days, and saw your camp, and we thought you were the conquistadors. But when we came up, we realized you weren't conquistadors, but we didn't know who you were. And Cuto looks at him and he says, "You've been tracking them. Was there anything peculiar about the tracks?" And Feather looks at him for a second and then signs with his hands. "Why, yes. Yes, one of the men had a deformed foot that turned outward, and his tracks are unmistakable." And Cuto gives him a big smile and tells him about the battle with the conquistadors back by the stream. And Feather says, "Now we're twice in your debt. You saved my daughter, and you have avenged our women. I invite you to come as long as you're in the area. You are our guests. You are be part of our village. You are guests. Anything we can do for you, we'll do. We're forever in your debt." So they have sort of a feast that morning. Well, the Pueblos are real interested in the atlatls and in the slings. The atlatls they caught on to pretty quickly because they were used to throwing spears, so that wasn't too hard. But the slings was another matter, and they were amazed at the accuracy that Cuto and Rhea had with the slings. So of course they had to try them themselves. And rocks went everywhere, hit them in the feet, went everywhere, flying everywhere. People had to duck time after time. Everybody was roaring. And finally, one warrior put the whole group on the ground, rolling with laughter, when the sling somehow wrapped itself around his neck and the loaded pouch blacked his left eye. And that was enough for them. They all laughed and roared, but they didn't try the slings too much longer. So they headed home to the Pueblo Indians' place, and they had to get away from the stream, but these Indians knew the desert really, really well, and every night they would camp at a small spring that the Indians knew where the spring was. And as they went along, again in sign language, Cuto was talking to Feather about Santa Fe. And Feather said, "Yeah, Santa Fe is not far from our pueblo, which is where we live, and we trade with them." he said, however, we have to be very, very careful. He said the conquistadors are very arrogant and they provoke our men to anger, and there's nothing better that they like to do than torture and kill Indians. And Cuto said, well, why do you deal with them? And Feather said, well, they need they they need food, and we're farmers, and we grow a lot of crops, and they pay well for the food. And he said, besides, there's some men in black robes that have joined them, and they are much more kind. They're much kinder. And since those men in black have arrived at Santa Fe, the the conquistadors are much more calm with our people. However, we only send the old men and old women into town to trade. We do not send any young girls or boys because they take them as slaves, and we don't send any young men because even now the young men get provoked to anger pretty easily. So on they went, and one of the things Cuto asked was, "Well, you supply vegetables to them, but what about meat?" And Feather gave him a sharp look, and he said, "They would pay well for meat. All their meat comes packed in a salty water in barrels, and it doesn't taste very good. We're farmers, we're not hunters, but I think they would pay well for meat." "Why do you ask?" And Cuto said, "Well, I'm a hunter." So, 3 or 4 days later, they approached a large uh, building that the Aztecs had never seen anything like before. It was 3 stories high. They'd never seen anything higher, bigger than a 1 story small adobe house. This building was 3 stories high and made in the shape of a sort of in the shape of a U. There were 2 wings that went out from a central portion, sort of making a little plaza inside the 2 wings. And as they got closer and closer, uh, Swallow broke away and started running as best she could on her bandaged feet. And Feather said she's going to see her mother. And Swallow quickly got ahead of the rest of them. And as she got to the building, they could see that there were no windows on the ground level. No windows at all. It was solid wall. And there were windows on the second level and on the third level, and there were ladders going from the ground to the second level, and ladders going from the second level to the third level. And Swallow headed right for one of the ladders, and a woman tried to stop her, and Swallow yelled at something at the woman, and the woman, backed away, and then all of a sudden hurried to another group of women and started waving her arms and talking in a voice they could hear even from all that distance. Swallow flew up the ladder to the second level, flew up a ladder to the third level, and ducked into an opening, a doorway at the third level. And in a few minutes, a woman came out with her arm around Swallow, and Feather signed she found her mother. So the people, the Pueblo Indians, welcomed them in. They had a big feast, and they were all the 7 of them were given rooms up on the third level, and it was the first time in, gosh, I don't know what, 3 months that they had slept indoors, and they had they were welcomed really gladly, and it was explained to everybody else what Cuto and his men and Ria had done to the conquistadors and how they'd saved Swallow. Anyway, um, Cuto, about 2 days later, Cuto said he'd like to go to town because um, Feather had signed that the conquistadors kept very, very careful control of their horses. And Cuto remembered Adzul saying that conquistadors on horses, a few conquistadors on horses, could always defeat Aztecs or Inca warriors on foot. So he'd never seen a horse, and he was anxious to see these animals. So he and uh, Feather went to town. Now they wore blankets around them, and Feather said, "You've got to do what I tell you. You cannot um, attract attention to yourself. You've got to be very, very humble because these men are on edge and they will do anything if they get an excuse. Even with the men in black around, these soldiers will do anything if they get an excuse. They're bored and they're very arrogant." So Cuto agreed, and they went into Santa Fe, and they came to a the square, which is still there today. And the square was in the shape of almost an exact square made out of buildings, one-story buildings, with a big gate on one of the sides. And inside the square, along the back of the square, was a long building with many, 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 many doors. That building, it's been restored, but it's still there in Santa Fe today. Um, and around the sides of the square were other buildings with doors, and and again a big gate. And they walked into and there was bare dirt on the ground inside the square, and on the dirt, when they walked in, were blankets and about 12 old Indian men and women with baskets of vegetables and fruit in front of them, and those were the traders from the Pueblo. And there were a few men wandering uh, among the traders and buying stuff, trading with them for food. Among them, a couple of these men dressed in black with generally beards. And in one corner of the square was a corral, and in the corral were a few horses. And Cuto immediately looked at those horses, and he and Feather were signing to each other under the cover of their blankets. They were holding the blankets in front of them away from their hands and signing so that they didn't appear to be doing anything unusual, because Feather was concerned that the conquistadors would notice a stranger among them if they saw them signing. So Cuto asks, "Are those the horses?" And Feather says yes. And Cuto says, "They're much bigger than I thought they'd be." And so he's looking at the horses, and Feather signs, "Don't pay too much attention to them. You see that man over there?" And there was a man leaning against a doorway watching them. And he had a conquistador. He had a sword at his side and a pointed black beard and black hair, and they were at a distance, but his eyes had been on them the minute they walked through the gate. And and Feather said, "See that man over there?" And Cuto said, "Yeah." And Feather said, "That's one of the worst of the conquistadors. He will torture and kill anybody on the slightest provocation, and he's watching us. It's time to leave." So they turned around, and actually, the traders were just picking up because it was the end of the trading time. They turned around and went back out through the gate and went back to the Pueblo. Well, um, the Aztecs found that the Pueblos, up on top of a big mesa, big flat area, big flat hill, behind the Pueblo, had an incredible system of gardens and basins cut into the stone for water to hold rainwater, incredible irrigation system. And they were farmers. Well, the Aztecs were farmers, so they immediately, the five Aztec men immediately got into planting, talking about planting and signing about planting and crops and so on. Cuto and Rhea went out into the hills frequently to hunt for the Pueblo, and Swallow went along with them a lot of the time. And they were, Cuto was gradually teaching Swallow how to use a sling. And one day they were way far out in the desert, far out in the desert. And there was a rabbit, and not too far away. And Cuto suggested that Swallow have a try at the rabbit with her sling, and she did and missed. But when she threw, the rabbit was in front of them. That is, they were still facing away from the Pueblo, which was, hours of walking behind them. And Swallow says, "Oh, I know where we are." And she says, "Come on." And they walk ahead about another 100 yards, and they come to the edge of a cliff. And the cliff is overlooking a valley about 300 feet down, 100 yards, the length of a football field, down from the edge of the cliff. Pretty sheer cliffs, all going straight down to this valley. The valley was pretty wide. It was about a half a mile wide. And then another set of cliffs going up on the other side of the valley, on the western side. They were on the eastern side. On the western side, there was a stream and grass down in the valley. And Feather says, "I know this place. Follow me." And she walks for about 10 minutes along the edge of the cliff, and they follow her. And Rhea says, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And Swallow says, "Yeah, my dad showed this to me many years ago. It's pretty cool. I know exactly where we are. Follow me." And she went for about 15 minutes, and then she stopped. And all of a sudden, she turned toward the desert, away from the cliff, toward the desert. And she said, look over there by those bushes, pretty far out there. Is that a desert sheep?" And Cuto and Rhea, being hunters, immediately swung around and looked, searching the desert to find the sheep. And they looked and looked, and they had really sharp eyes. And they looked and looked. And Cuto says, "I don't see any sheep. Do you, Rhea?" And she says, "No." They turn around to tell Swallow they don't see anything. And she's gone. And that is the end of episode 3. Now, for those of you who have read this, you know what happens. But for those of you who haven't read this, and if you want to have your hand at writing and imagination, why don't you write what you think happened? And you'll find out in episode 4. So have fun with that.